All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. A couple of things to tell you, I guess, at the start of the show today. Number one, I am done with my book, Politics, Economics, and New Testament Interpretation, and it will be out later on this year. I finished it up. I'm recording this on Sunday, January the 18th. I finished it up on Friday afternoon. I'm really excited about it. It's super long, but I cover almost every single text in the New Testament that has anything to do with political or economic themes. So it's going to be very comprehensive. And I set it all against the theoretical framework of Austrian economics to make the argument that authoritarian socialism, which is the prevailing pattern of political and economic thought in the modern era, both on the conservative right and the progressive left, is completely incompatible with the New Testament witness. I'm really excited about that book, and I cannot wait for you guys to get it out. I'll know a little bit more in the next 2 or 3 weeks about when this is going to be coming, but I know it will be in 2016, and I'm hoping that it'll be the summer when the weather is warm. So I'm excited for you guys to get it. It was a very big privilege to write, and I appreciate you guys sticking with me over the last several years of this show and making this all possible. So I'm just excited to get it out there. And one of the things that I'm going to do over the next year or so, you guys know my show. I interview a lot of biblical scholars. I talk to a lot of economists and political philosophers, and I do a lot of solo episodes on the Bible because that's what I'm interested in. And I'm obviously the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. So our shows cover the intersection between politics, economics, and faith. And there were a lot of ideas that I uncovered in my research, a lot of ways of looking at the Bible that I am going to be sharing on the show this year because I think that they're relevant for the way that we read the political and economic texts of the New Testament, or the way that we take the principles that are embedded in the New Testament and apply those principles to the modern world. And what we're going to do on today's episode is talk about one aspect of the research that I've done over the last year and how I think that this can more helpfully shape our reading of Romans 13. And I know that if you're listening to a show that's published by the Libertarian Christian Institute, you're probably interested in Romans 13 and how to interpret it best. So we're going to go over Romans 13 again today, but I'm only going to be focusing on one particular aspect of this. And this is not like what I'm going to say on the show is not earth shattering. It's not world changing, but it does help us better understand the context of Romans 13 and the ideas that undergird Paul's rhetoric there. And I think that there are a lot of people that make a ton of assumptions about what Paul is doing in Romans 13 that absolutely have nothing to do with either the text itself or Paul's own historical or intellectual context. And that's what we're going to be doing on the show today. So Romans 13, we've been here a million times. You guys know Romans 13. I think that the Libertarian Christian Institute, it's like every 2 or 3 months we publish something on it. And so I'm going to go ahead and read it, though, just so that we know what we're talking about and so that we have this passage in mind as we start going through the idea that I want to discuss today. So I'm going to clear my throat. Very good. Ready to go. So Romans 13, 1 through 7, this is what Paul says. He says, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing, render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And of course, every time you talk to a Christian who is a progressive or a conservative and you tell them that you're a libertarian, if they've read the Bible, they're always like, what about Romans 13? This is something that I've had happen to me on Twitter over and over and over again. You can't be a Christian and a libertarian because of Romans 13. Now, I'm going to put down a marker here, and I've said it before, and I'll say it again and again and again. No one actually takes Romans 13 completely seriously. And no one thinks that Romans 13 is an absolute text that is binding on Christians at all times and in all situations. And there are good reasons for that, right? I mean, look at verse 2 of Romans chapter 13. It says, therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. So the immediate follow-up question to that, okay, so you might have someone that says, well, you can't be a libertarian and be a Christian because if you're opposed to government authority, then you are obviously contradicting Paul's teachings in Romans 13. Okay, well, does this apply to like the Nazi regime in Germany during World War II? Or does this apply to Stalin's Russia? I think that most Christians would say no. And if you were a Christian that was alive in, as many German Christians were, if you were alive in Germany during World War II and you understood what was going on with concentration camps, would you have been in the right to oppose it? Well, I think that any morally consistent Christian would have to say, yeah, absolutely. Like, you should not have been obedient to Adolf Hitler because he was an evil person. And if Adolf Hitler handed you a pistol and told you to shoot an innocent Jewish person, would you do it? And if your answer to that question is no, and you're not a libertarian, then you no longer get to tell me as a libertarian that I can't be a libertarian based on Romans 13:2, because Romans 13:2 says that whoever resists the authority, whoever resists authority is opposed to the ordinance of God. But we all know that there are limits to that, right? Obviously, and Paul is not stupid about that. Okay, Paul himself. This is another thing I'm sure we'll talk about on a different show. But Paul himself in Acts chapter 16 directly opposes the Philippian authorities. He directly defies a command that the authorities of the city of Philippi give him. So even Paul knows there are limits to this, right? So we all know that. But what I really want to focus on today is what Paul said right before this verse. And this is where he says that there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Okay? So what Paul seems to be saying here is that all of the political authorities are established by God and they exist because of him. And then he says again in verse 6 that the authorities are servants of God. Okay, so political rulers are servants of God. That's what we're going to focus on today. What does it mean for the authorities to be established by God? And what does it mean that rulers, political rulers, are servants of God? What does that mean contextually, right? Now, we've already established that there are limits to this. And even like the Christian nationalists who would appeal to this verse to say that the law should be binding on all people at all times and in all places. And if you have, a civil magistrate or a civil authority, then we have, a right or a duty to obey them. Even they would recognize that there are limits to this, right? That there are certain rulers that don't seem to be in positions of authority because God wants them to be in positions of authority. So what exactly is it that Paul is doing and saying here? And what is the political principle that we should draw from this text? Now, I got to say here, this is where, and I've been critical of this before. I released an episode, and I'll try to remember to put this in the show notes, that got a little bit of heat from some listeners in my audience called "Everyone is Wrong About Romans 13," including me. Important caveat there, where I just talked about some of the deficiencies that I have perceived in the theological reading of Romans 13. And this is one of the problems with a text like Romans 13, is that Christians are so concerned, and rightly so. These are Christians that believe that the Bible is authoritative, which I absolutely love, and I agree with them, and I love and endorse that sentiment. Right? They believe that the Bible is authoritative, and they want to know what Romans 13 means. And so they go to Romans 13, they read the rhetoric, they might try to do a little bit of historical reconstruction, a little bit of background information, but the point of Romans 13 is to craft a timeless political theology that can guide people that are living in all times and in all places. Now, I do think that there are principles that come out of Romans 13 that are universally applicable. I think that that's actually possible to do, but not in the way that many theological readings of Romans 13 suggest. Because the goal of the theological reading is to say, well, what does it mean? There has to be some sort of theological justification for the authorities being established by God. There has to be some sort of abstract system of theology that we can fit this verse into. And then when it comes to taxation, authorities doing good and doing evil and all of that kind of stuff, there has to be some sort of abstract theological explanation for it. And I want to put the brakes on that. I want to slow down and say, hey, I think that maybe, just maybe, we need to set this in its historical context before we go making all of these claims about what the text means. And my own Paul professor, James Smith, who he's Australian. I think he's living and maybe teaching back in Australia now. I haven't talked to him in several years. Brilliant. But he has an excellent book called Marks of the Apostle. And he, like me, and he was actually the one that pushed me to read the postmodernist and really start thinking about the subjectivity of human knowledge, which is an idea that's quite compatible with the Austrian School of Economics and the subjective theory of value. But I just put my marker down there. And that doesn't mean I agree with everything that postmodernists say, or even that I believe that postmodernism is one thing, which it's not. Like the postmodernist philosophers disagree about all kinds of issues, but they agree on epistemology, and that's just that human beings are subjective, and we have to take that into consideration when assessing truth claims. I think that that's really important. But anyways, my Paul professor, James Smith, he has, I think he's only published one book. It was his doctoral dissertation. It's called Marks of the Apostle, and it's about Paul's letter to the Philippians. And he, in that book, has this really great section, and I incorporated this in my own work because it was very fundamental for my thinking about Paul, 15, 20 years ago when I started studying Paul in an academic setting, where he talks about how Christians are so concerned with the meaning of a text that we forget that a text can't mean anything outside of its function, right? So he has this hermeneutical dichotomy between the meaning of the text and a function of the text. Now, the function of a given text is what that text was intended to do for its audience when it was originally composed by its author, right? And the point that Dr. Smith makes is that the Apostle Paul is not writing for no reason whatsoever. He's not trying to compose a system of abstract theology. Paul has a particular function in mind. Paul is trying to communicate a particular message to a particular group of people, and all of his rhetoric is designed to meet that end, right? So that would be the function of Romans 13. What is Romans 13 trying to do? And until we at least make an attempt to determine the function, how does it work within the flow of Paul's wider thought, and then the rhetorical context of Romans as a whole, and then also the smaller section of Romans in which it's included, we can't really make any abstract theological claims about the meaning of the text, because the meaning is intrinsically connected to the function, if that makes sense, right? Like the text can't mean something in any objective sense that Paul never intended it to mean. So with Romans 13, a great example, and this is something that people on the left and the right, both, like, people give lip service to this idea. I'm reading a book right now by Caitlin Scheiss, The Bible in the Ballot Box, or Caitlin Scheiss or whatever. And she makes the same point about Romans 13, that it wasn't meant to be a political philosophy in all times and all places, but then she draws a bunch of theological conclusions from Romans 13 that I don't think are historically viable, because I think that a lot of people fail to take this distinction between function and meaning into consideration, right? So even before we ask the historical question, I'm only going to focus on one aspect of this today. This could be a whole podcast series. Really, it could be an entire book, an entire monograph. There could be an entire study on what it means for the authorities to be established by God. But I want to put this marker down, that Romans 13 has a very particular function within Paul's letter to the Romans. And that function cannot be contradicted, or whatever meaning we draw from Romans 13 cannot contradict its original function. So we know that at the very opening, like in the very opening passages of Paul's letter, Romans 1:1-5, he outlines his gospel. And at the center of his gospel is the crucified and resurrected Davidic Messiah. That is at the heart of what Paul is, arguing or talking about in Romans, right? And for Paul, the gospel is all about Jesus as king and everything that entails. And then at the very end of Paul's letter, he also talks about Jesus being king. And then he wraps up, the main body of his letter, and at the end of Romans 15, by again referring to the fact that Jesus is king over all of the nations, right? So it's the Davidic messianic kingly status of Jesus hangs over Romans. And I think that that's intentional. And if you look at Romans 1-11, not diving into any of the theological controversies that are found in those passages, but the big picture, whatever you make of it, I think we can all agree that Romans 1-11 is about the function of Romans 1-11 is Paul trying to explain how the relationship between Jews and non-Jews who believe in Jesus ought to be optimally understood in the church. I think, was that a pretty theologically neutral way of describing that, right? So it's about the identity of the church. And I think that that's something that, whether you're Catholic or Reformed or Wesleyan or whatever tradition you come from, I think we can all agree that whatever you say about the details of Romans 1-11, it is primarily about the identity of the church. The function of Romans is for Paul to outline the identity of the church en route to, he has a couple of other agendas that he outlines at the end of the book, like his mission to Spain and his collection to Jerusalem and all of those kind of things. All right, but we can't forget forget that Paul has framed everything he says with the Christology of Jesus, and then he spends 11 chapters talking about the identity of the church. And then in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, he transitions and he says, therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And this kind of hangs over chapter 12 and chapter 13 in Romans. And so Paul talks about, again, the relationship between different believers, that all the believers are members of one body, that believers need to be devoted to one another and love one another, that we need to seek peace with all people, that we should leave vengeance for God. Then he has this instruction on relating to the government authorities. And then he talks about owing nothing to anyone except for a love for neighbor in Romans 13. Then he says at the end of chapter 13, do everything that I've just instructed you, knowing that our salvation is almost at hand, right? Like the hour is almost near. So the function is to give the Romans instructions about how to behave in light of the fact that they are a part of God's family, right? How are you going to offer your body as a living sacrifice to God? How are you going to be transformed by the renewing of your mind, based on the fact that you are a part of God's family? This is in Romans 13, whatever we make of Paul's rhetoric there, Romans 13 fits into that specific function, which means that Paul's instructions about the governing authorities being established by God also has to fit within that particular function of the text. So we don't want to go to Romans 13 and abstract Romans 13, 1 through 7 from its either immediate context in Romans 12 or 13, or its larger, wider rhetorical context in the letter to the Romans at all, which is presupposed, book-ended on both ends, like a giant a giant rhetorical inclusio, book-ended on both ends by the Davidic messianic status of Jesus, who is worldwide king over all of creation, right? Romans 13 has to fit within that framework, and any analysis of Romans 13 that does not do justice to that context is by default going to be deficient and probably make mistakes. And this is where the theological readings that are quick to try to pull a meaning out of this text without slowly thinking about its function, that is where those texts are going to fall short. So we have to ask a couple of questions about this then. What does it mean when, or what is Paul doing when he says that authorities are established by God and that rulers are servants of God? How does this fit within Paul's larger framework? Well, we basically have two things that we have to analyze on the show, all right, today. And that's what we're going to be doing over the next 15 or 20 minutes. So number one, we have to set this in the context of Paul's statements about Jesus and his messianic Davidic status. We have to look at Paul's understanding of messianic Christology and what is the likely background for that. When Paul talks about Jesus being the king, which he does at multiple points in the letter to the Romans, and he says it in absolute terms, what does he mean by that? Is this a spiritualized kingship? Is this some sort of two kingdoms theology where Jesus is king up there and we have different kings down here, where Jesus is maybe king in our heart or king of the church, but that kingly status has no bearing on what happens in the rest of the world? Or does Paul mean something else by that? And I'm going to argue that Paul absolutely does mean something else by that. And then the second question is, where do temporal pagan secular authorities fit within that framework? And is there something historically, is there an aspect of Paul's thought historically that might help us better understand what he's saying about the authorities being established by God in Romans 13? And I think if we answer both of these questions, then it helps us better understand the function of Paul's rhetoric, and then it allows us to draw meaning out of this text, which we can then use to deduce principles that we can apply to the modern world. I think we have to have all of these things to consider. Now, the very first thing that I want to do, the very first point that I want to make here, is that if you look at Paul's background, Paul is a Jew, a Jewish Pharisee, who is obviously deeply familiar with the Old Testament and the promises that God made to Israel in the Old Testament. So Paul is not unaware of all of the messianic claims and all of the messianic prophecies that are included in the Old Testament. And the most fundamental of all of these prophecies, and I think that this is just impossible to ignore, is 2 Samuel 7. And if you're someone who's listening to this show and you're not very familiar with the Bible, because we've been talking about this in our new small group for a couple of weeks, and I think I've made this point about 2 Samuel 7 a couple of times. If you want to understand the messianic or the Davidic significance of Jesus, then 2 Samuel 7 is a passage that you need to commit to memory. If you can memorize one chapter, or at least remember the location of one chapter in the Old Testament, then 2 Samuel 7 is one of the best. And the reason why is that in 2 Samuel 7, God makes King David, the greatest king in the Old Testament, despite all of his flaws and failures, God makes David a massive promise. And the crux of the promise is in 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 13. And this is what God says to David. He says, when your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So what is God promising David in 2 Samuel 7? God is promising David that David will have an offspring, a descendant, who will be given an everlasting kingdom, a throne that will endure forever and that will be established forever and that will never end. So when Matthew and Mark, both from the very opening lines of their gospels, say that Jesus is the son of David, the Christ, the anointed one, they're obviously talking about this prophecy. Right? They're obviously making the claim that Jesus is this king that was promised in 2 Samuel 7, and that this king will have an everlasting kingdom. And when Paul opens up his letter to the Romans and says that his gospel is about Jesus, the son of David, who was raised from the dead in accordance with Scripture, Paul's not going to be contradicting. Paul knows 2 Samuel 7. He knows the messianic prophecies. And so whatever he says about the political leaders of his time, it has to be framed within this messianic promise that God made to David in 2 Samuel 7. And Paul and the writers of the Gospels believe that that promise has come to fruition in Jesus. And I've read the Gospels before, and so have you, hopefully, and you've hopefully read Paul. I don't think that they read 2 Samuel 7 metaphorically. Like, I don't think that the writers of the gospel believe that Jesus, as the Davidic Messiah, was the king over individual hearts. Like what God promises David in 2 Samuel 7 is not, I'm going to give you a descendant, and when people have warm and fuzzy feelings about him, then they're going to be a part of some spiritual kingship. That's not at all what God is promising to David. God is promising David that one of his sons will establish an everlasting kingdom. And that kingdom has already been established by Jesus. All right. And this is not something that is isolated to 2 Samuel 7. In fact, we're going to look at two passages, one in Isaiah and one in Jeremiah, where those prophets make the exact same messianic claims based on the promise that God made to David in 2 Samuel 7. But this is literally all over the Old Testament. You can look, I mean, there are all these royal Psalms. I go over the litany a lot on the show, but it's Psalm 2, Psalm 72, Psalm 89, Psalm 110. There are so many places in the Psalms that look forward to the day of the restoration of David's line. You can see this also in the minor prophets. This is Micah 4. I know Daniel's not really, I don't know if Daniel's really one of the minor prophets or not. There's debates about that, but Daniel 7, the Son of Man, is certainly a messianic figure who delivers God an eternal kingdom. It's stitched into the Old Testament narrative that God will one day restore the line of David objectively in a real sense, and that son of David will rule over all of creation forevermore. And I am going to argue that Paul believes that has happened in and through Jesus, and that not only does Paul believe that, but the rest of the writers of the New Testament absolutely believe that God's promises to David have already been fulfilled. It's done in Jesus. Now, it's not finished. The cycle's not finished. It hasn't reached its denouement, but the kingdom of God has been inaugurated through the life of the Messiah, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension, where he currently sits at the right hand of the Father. So when Paul talks about the authorities being established by God, God is sovereign over the authorities, that the rulers are servants of God. That in no way negates his ridiculously high universal Christology of Jesus's Davidic eternal kingship, right? Those two things have to be balanced out. And I think that there are a lot of Christians that have come, and this has precedence way back in antiquity, right? There are a lot of Christians that have come to the conclusion, well, that Jesus is king of one realm and men are king of the other, and used Romans 13 to justify that. But I don't think that that's what Paul is saying in Romans 13. I actually think that Paul has something else in mind when he talks about the authorities being established by God, because it really does seem that Paul thinks that Jesus is already king over all of creation and that those who believe in him are his people. And I think we should take that seriously. So the Davidic Christology of the Old Testament is, I think, the proper historical background for understanding all of Paul's thinking about the temporal authorities, all of them, right? The king has already come. He's already sitting on the throne, and that's a reality. But we also have to deal with the reality that there are still secular, pagan authorities in place. And what is God going to do with them? Now, this is where we're going to take a look at the prophets. And I want to start in Isaiah chapter 10. Now, if we look at Isaiah 9 through 11 and then Jeremiah 30 through 33, we're going to be looking at the passages right before Jeremiah 30 through 33. But these are two of the greatest messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, talking about the coming kingdom of David. And in fact, before we even get to Isaiah chapter 10, and again, I did what I always do. I never actually bookmark any of this stuff in my Bible, so I just kind of aimlessly flip through it and waste your time. But I'll be there in just a second, just a couple pages at a time. Okay, so like in Isaiah chapter 9, all right, and we're in January, so we're not far away from Christmas time. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 and 7. This is what Isaiah says. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this, right? So whenever God acts to restore Israel, he will install, a la 2 Samuel 7, his Davidic Messiah, the son of David, on the throne, and that son of David will have an everlasting kingdom, and there'll be no end to the increase of his government or of peace, and he will establish it and uphold it with justice. Okay, so this prophecy frames what we are about to read in Isaiah chapter 10. Okay, so just like Paul has this seeming tension, this seeming contradiction in Romans, where he says that Jesus is the universal Davidic Messiah, but also that the pagan authorities are established by God, Isaiah's already set up this dynamic where he's looking forward to the day when God restores Israel and fulfills his promise to David to give him an everlasting kingdom. But something has to happen in the meantime. And that thing that has to happen in the meantime is that Israel is going to be judged for its unfaithfulness to the covenant, right? God, this is what the Pentateuch, the laws are fundamentally about. God gives Israel the law. And if you read Deuteronomy 27 through 30, he makes a covenant or a promise to Israel that if Israel is faithful to God and follows the law, that he will keep Israel in the land and make them secure and at peace. And if not, then they'll be defeated by the pagans and taken off into exile. And as we know, Israel chose the second option. They chose to be disobedient, and then they were taken into exile. And God talks about how unfaithful Israel is going to be taken into exile by the Assyrians in chapter 10. So this is what Isaiah says in chapter 10 of Isaiah, verse 5. He says, woe to Assyria. So he's talking about the Assyrian Empire. And again, just a little bit of historical background here. After the reign of David's son Solomon, the united family of Israel is broken up into two different kingdoms because Solomon's sons, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, have a civil war, and Israel is divided up into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians for its sinfulness in 722. The southern kingdom is destroyed by the Babylonians for their infidelity to God's law in 586. So this is talking about Assyria and the northern kingdom, which would be destroyed in 722. But note what Isaiah says: woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. I send it against a godless nation and commission it against the people of my fury. Okay, so what is God saying here? What is Isaiah saying about God here? That Assyria is the staff in God's hand. So in other words, God is using Assyria. Assyria has been established by God for what purpose? to capture booty and to seize plunder, to trample them down like mud in the streets. I send it against a godless nation and commission it against the people of my fury. So again, God is using Assyria. He's established the Assyrian government, the Assyrian empire, to punish Israel for its unfaithfulness. And he even says here, and this is very kind of like a reform sounding way of describing it, yet it does not so intend, nor does it plan so in its heart, but rather it is its purpose to destroy and to cut off many nations. For it says, are not my princes all kings? It's talking about the Assyrians. Is not Calno like Carchemish, or Hamath like Arphad, or Samaria like Damascus? As my hand has reached to the kingdom of the idols, whose graven images were greater than those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not do to Jerusalem and her images just as I have done to Samaria and her idols? Okay, so God is using the Assyrians to punish the northern kingdom for their sins against God, for failing to maintain covenant just as God promised he would in Deuteronomy 27 through 30. So, and even in verse 7, yet it does not so intend, nor does it plan so in its heart. Like the Assyrians, the way that the prophet Isaiah is framing this is that the Assyrians don't really have a choice in the matter. The Assyrians are going to destroy the northern kingdom because God has established them to do exactly that. The Assyrians are a staff in God's hand to judge Israel for its unfaithfulness. Okay, so if we were going to convert Isaiah into Pauline terms, he might say that the Assyrians are servants of God. No authorities exist which have not been established by God. So God is sovereign over the Assyrians. But then in verse 12 of Isaiah, immediately after, the prophet talks about how God is going to use Isaiah and is using Isaiah, not Isaiah, how God is using Assyria to punish the northern kingdom. Isaiah says this, so it will be that when the Lord has completed all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the pomp of his haughtiness. For he has said, by the power of my hand and by my wisdom I did this, for I have understanding and I removed the boundaries of people and plundered their treasures. And like a mighty man, I brought down their inhabitants. And he goes on and on and on about how great he is and all of that stuff, just talking about how great he is. All right. The king of Assyria, right? But notice already the dynamic at play here, that God has used and established Assyria as the rod of his judgment, but that the king of Assyria is going to be brought down once God uses Assyria for the very specific purpose of punishing his people for violating the covenant that they made with God. And then we move on to Isaiah 10, verse 20, and it says, now in this day, the remnant of Israel and those of the house of Jacob who have escaped will never again rely on the one who struck them, aka Assyria, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though your people, O Israel, be like the sand of the sea, only a remnant within them will return. A destruction is determined, overflowing with righteousness. For a complete destruction, one that is decreed, the Lord God of hosts will execute in the midst of the land as a whole. Okay, so Israel, at least the remnant of Israel, those who are faithful, will be brought back to the land in the end, but God is going to work through the arrogant Assyrians to execute his judgment and punishment against the wickedness of Israel. But right after this passage in verse 24, here's what Isaiah says, therefore, thus says the Lord God of hosts, O my people who dwell in Zion, do not fear the Assyrians, who strike you with the rod and lift up his staff against you the way Egypt did. For in a very little while, my indignation against you will be spent, and my anger will be directed to their destruction. The Lord of hosts will arouse a scourge against him like the slaughter of Midian at the rock of Oreb, and his staff will be over the sea, and he will lift it up the way he did in Egypt. So it will be in that day that his burden will be removed from your shoulders and his yoke from your neck, and the yoke will be broken because of his fatness. Okay, so God has established Israel. Not Israel. Well, I mean, yes, he did establish Israel. God has established Assyria. The Assyrians were servants of God to execute his wrath against Israel. But once the purpose for which God called the Assyrians is spent, then the Assyrians will be punished for their arrogance against Israel. God will act to redeem and rescue the remnant, the small, faithful remnant who never compromised their belief and remain faithful to God for the entire time. He will bring them back to the land and punish Assyria. So Paul is not unfamiliar. He's not unfamiliar at all with this passage. Paul understands how this dynamic works. And so when Paul says in Romans chapter 13 that all of the political authorities are established by God, all right, he means that in the exact same sense that the prophet Isaiah does, that God uses political leaders for particular purposes and then discards them when they are done. that it's over. It's that they're no longer, all right. They're not needed. Now, again, you might have some reformed people, and I love my reformed audience here. I don't think that there's any incompatibility between God's divine sovereignty over the events of the world and humans' ability to make choices and have moral autonomy. I don't think there's any sort of disjunction or discrepancy between those two things. I think they're both very equally possible, and I think that's exactly what's going on in this text. But the main point is that when we're reading Romans 13, okay, and Paul says that the authorities are established by God. Well, Isaiah said that the authorities were established by God, and that's not a good thing because the authorities wound up being destroyed in the end so that God could rescue those that were faithful to him. And then what's so amazing about this is the text that follows in Isaiah 11. So right after God talks about how he's going to use Assyria and then discard them, he goes back to this Davidic promise. Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, Jesse being David's father, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. The spirit of the Lord will rest upon him, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and strength. With righteousness, he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. The wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leper will lie down with the young calf. I'm kind of skipping through here. They will not hurt or destroy on my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Then in that day, the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. So God is going to destroy the Assyrians that he used to punish Israel. He's going to restore the faithful remnant, and he's going to reestablish the Davidic line. And all of this happens in 3 chapters in Isaiah. 3 chapters. And even better than that, Isaiah 11:10, which is what I just quoted, where he says that in that day, the nations will resort to the root of Jesse. Paul quotes that exact passage in Romans 15:12. At the very end of Romans 15, he says, for I say that Christ has become a servant to the circumcision on behalf of truth of God, to confirm the promises given to the fathers, to confirm the promises, and for the Gentiles to glorify God. And he quotes this, and Isaiah says, there shall come the root of Jesse, and he who arises to rule over the Gentiles, and him the Gentiles shall hope. So again, Paul is saying that this Jesus, this son of David, this long promised Messiah from 2 Samuel 7, rules over all creation. And what about the temporal authorities? What about the Assyrians? Well, yeah, the Assyrians were established by God. They were used by God. They were God's servant for a very particular purpose. And then God utterly destroyed them and is going to bring about the fulfillment of his promise in the future. And I think that that's the exact framework through which we should read Paul's comments on the establishment of the authorities in Romans 13. I think that's exactly what Paul is getting at. Why would he quote Isaiah 11? Why would he quote Isaiah 11:10 in Romans 15 if he didn't have that in mind? Paul's not unfamiliar with this dynamic in the Old Testament. He's a Jew, a Pharisee, for crying out loud. Paul knows his Old Testament. He understands these promises. He understands the language of divine sovereignty. He understands God's position towards the pagan nations. Right? And Assyria is a great example of rulers that have been established by God for a particular purpose that God then discards. And I think that has to be the proper historical and theological framework for understanding the function of Romans 13. When very Jewish Paul starts making claims about governments being established or authorities being established by God, it's the Isaiah 10 model, right? This isn't to promote them. This isn't to say that these authorities have existential validity on their own. This isn't to say that God, timelessly desires arbitrary civil government. This is not what Paul is saying at all. He's thinking within that framework of Isaiah 10. And again, the knockdown, drag out, like nail in the coffin argument for this is in Isaiah 15, is in Romans 15, where Paul quotes Isaiah 11:10. Now, if this was one isolated case, someone could say, okay, well, this isn't really a major theme in the Old Testament. We don't really take that very seriously, but it's not. So we're going to flip over to the next major prophet, Jeremiah, and this is in Jeremiah 25. Now, at this point, the northern kingdom is dead and gone, right? The Assyrians won the day. The Assyrians came in and absolutely decimated the northern kingdom. But guess what? The judgment that Isaiah said will befall the Assyrians happened with the Babylonians. The Babylonians come in and they destroy the Assyrians, right? And so now the Babylonians are in charge in the ancient Near East, and they're the de facto world empire, right? But the southern kingdom, just like the northern kingdom, has been unfaithful to God's covenant. They have not done what God has wanted them to do. All right. And so God is saying through the prophet Jeremiah that the southern kingdom will be taken into exile in Babylon as a result of their unfaithfulness to the covenant. And this is, again, just, I want you to keep, we've already read Romans 13, 1-7. We've already talked about the authorities being established by God. We've already talked about messianism in the Old Testament. We've already talked about Isaiah 10. All right. So with all of that stuff in mind, listen to what the prophet Jeremiah says here. And this is starting in verse 8 of chapter 25. Okay. And this is God's response to Israel's unfaithfulness vis-a-vis the covenant of Deuteronomy 27-30. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, declares the Lord, and I will send to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants and against all these nations round about. And I will utterly destroy them and make them a horror and a hissing and an everlasting desolation. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. This whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So in verse 9, Jeremiah 25, verse 9. What is it that Jeremiah says about Nebuchadnezzar, the pagan polytheistic king of Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, servant of God. All right, Babylon, the king of Babylon, is God's servant in Jeremiah 25, 9. The servant of God. So looking at the rhetoric of Romans one more time, what is it that Paul says in Romans? What is it that Paul says in Romans 13:1? For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. And then in verse 6, for rulers are servants of God. So Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, is a servant of God because God is using him for a particular purpose. Does this mean that God therefore legitimizes all of the decisions made by the king of Babylon? Absolutely not. Does this mean that God thinks that the king of Babylon is the properly ordained, Torah following, God obedient, monotheistic king of Babylon, morally upright person, worshiper of Yahweh? No, absolutely not. Jeremiah is not making that claim about Nebuchadnezzar at all, right? He's just saying that Nebuchadnezzar is God's servant for a very particular point, and that is to execute the covenantal wrath against the southern kingdom for their unfaithfulness to God. The very next section of Jeremiah 25, Jeremiah 25, 12 and following says this: then it will be, when the 70 years of captivity are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation. I will bring upon that land all of my words, which I have pronounced against it, all that is written in this book, which Jeremiah has prophesied against all the nations. For many nations and great kings will make slaves of them, even them, and I will recompense them according to their deeds and according to the work. Talking about the Babylonians here. All right. For thus the Lord, the God of Israel, says to me, take this cup of the wine of wrath from my hand and cause all the nations to whom I send you to drink it. They will drink and stagger and go mad because of the sword that I will send among them. Okay, so how can, in literally the same exact chapter of Jeremiah, God say that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is the servant of God, and then also in the same breath say that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire is going to come to absolute ruin, that God is going to ultimately judge the Babylonians, wipe them off the face of the earth, and do whatever it is that he proposes to do after these evil empires are gone? Okay, so when Paul says in Romans 13 that the authorities are servants of God, that is not a good thing necessarily. Paul is not saying that they have eternal value, eternal legitimacy, that God always wants civil servants to be arbitrary rulers over all of creation. That's not what Paul is saying at all. Paul is obviously clearly referring back to these traditions and saying, oh yeah, Rome's a servant of God, wink, wink. We know what that means. We know what the Jewish tradition says about pagan governors and pagan governments being servants of God. They have a particular function and then they will be discarded by God. They're not going to make it in the end. None of them will. God will wipe them off the face of the planet. And what's funny about that is that in Jeremiah 29:7, which I'll do a whole episode on this at some point, because this is very important part of my book. But in Jeremiah 29:7, Jeremiah commands the Jews that are in captivity in Babylon to, I quote, seek the welfare of the city of Babylon, where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will have welfare. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophet, that's, we don't need to go to that part. But anyways, the point of this prophecy here, all right, is that God has said that Babylon is his servant, or Nebuchadnezzar is God's servant to execute vengeance, judgment against the southern kingdom. The Babylonians will also be destroyed. And that's what it means to be God's servant, as a pagan government. But for the Jews that go into exile in Babylon, they're to pray for the welfare of the city, because if Babylon does all right while they're in exile, then the Jews will do all right too. But that doesn't negate the promise that God makes through Jeremiah that the Babylonians are one day going to fall. So it seems like there's this tension where Jeremiah is saying, well, we should be seeking the welfare of the city and praying for them, but also we know that God is going to wipe them off the face of the planet. And what do we get? Just a couple of passages later. In Jeremiah 30, he talks about the restoration of Israel. For behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel. I will also bring them back to the land I will give to their forefathers, and they shall possess it. They shall serve the Lord their God, and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. This is Jeremiah 30 at verses 3 and 9 that I just quoted there. And then moving on to Jeremiah 33, again, following up on this. In those days and at that time, when God restores Israel, I will cause a righteous branch of David to spring forth, and he shall execute justice and righteousness on the earth. And in those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell in safety. Okay, so when God acts to restore the Davidic monarchy, the restoration of Israel has taken place, and therefore the pagan empires, the pagan authorities are in danger of being punished. All right, so all of these things can be true at once. And if you flip to the very end of Jeremiah, I'm not going to read anything from it, but if you flip to the very end of Jeremiah 50 and 51, the last two great oracles of woe, the great oracles of destruction, the great prophecies of calamity in Jeremiah are directed against Babylon, talking about how God is going to absolutely ravage Babylon and wipe Babylon off the face of the planet, even though in Jeremiah 25, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is God's servant. So what does it mean that the authorities are established by God? What does it mean that rulers are God's servants? It means that God can do to them whatever they want, and that whatever he wants, and that they don't have any lasting validity, because the only real king and the only real kingdom is that which is established by and given to the Son of David, who is Jesus. He's the only real king. And people that believe that Jesus is the only real king should act like it. We should just accept that as the truth, because I'm a simple-minded person. I know that the Christian nationalists out there, they have their natural philosophies and they read their Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and all that kind of stuff. And I've read them too. Okay. But I think I'm a lot more simple-minded than the Christian nationalist crowd, in that when the writers of the New Testament ubiquitously, without fail, claim that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah, all of 2 Samuel 7, and the entire testimony of the prophets and the Psalms, I take them at their word. Like, I think that they actually mean that. And I believe that the kingdom of God has been established, which is exactly what Jesus does in the Gospels. And I believe that Jesus is the only true king. And it's the big argument of Romans 1 through 11. I believe that that for both Jews and Gentiles that place their faith in the Davidic Messiah, Jesus, the long promised son of David, whose government will never stop increasing and who will continue to bring peace. When we submit to him, we are part of his kingdom and his kingdom alone. And I don't think that we should be in the business of trying to reestablish or propagate secular government. I don't at all. Like, I think that we should just completely reject that paradigm, because what does God do with all secular government? He destroys it. And this is Revelation. This is the book of Revelations, Revelation 18, the great whore of Babylon, the great whore of Babylon. We have to get the imagery here, right? Like, John is obviously talking about the Roman Empire, because that happens to be the pagan polytheistic empire that's in charge in his day. But think about the image of Babylon. All right. Babylon was destroyed. The Persians came in. The only pagan king that ever really gets any good press in the Old Testament is Cyrus. Isaiah 45:1. Cyrus calls him the anointed, Cyrus the Christ, because he allows the Jews to return back to their homeland. He's the only one that gets any good press, and God used Cyrus to overthrow the Babylonians and punish them. All right. But in the same way, all earthly empires will ultimately be destroyed. And we know that that's going to happen one day. So why, as Christians, will we read a passage like Romans 13 and think that Paul is somehow trying to legitimize the eternal value of secular government, that it has to be that we have to have a state, that we have to have arbitrary authority, that we have to have people violently and coercively ruling over us. That clearly can't be what Paul is getting at in Romans 13, because it doesn't make sense either of the rhetorical logic of Romans or Paul's own Jewish background. It doesn't make sense of his own historical context. We know he's deeply influenced by the Old Testament. He understands this narrative, and he makes certain claims about Jesus that are just irrefutably, from a theological perspective, they're just irrefutably true. And I think that Christians need to believe that. But if we read Romans 13 in isolation, or is that if that is somehow in competition with Paul's claims about the messianic Davidic status of Jesus, then we're going to wind up misunderstanding Romans 13, and we're going to wind up misunderstanding what it means for the authorities to be established by God and for the authorities to be their servants. And this is where I think for both Christian nationalists that want, I guess they call the position, Reconstructionism, where you want all of society to be explicitly based on biblical law. Well, you still have to use the violent, monopolistic, coercive force of the state to impose that upon unwilling people. And that doesn't seem to correspond at all to the example of the crucified Messiah who was hung on a Roman cross without fighting back, and whom Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2 that we need to cultivate that mind and be sacrificial towards all people. It's like the Christian nationalist, what they don't get is that when Paul says that Jesus is the Messiah, Paul really, really means it. And I don't think the Christian nationalists do. Like, I don't think that they believe that Jesus is the Messiah, at least not in the sense that the writers of the Bible say that he is. But then again, this is the problem. So Christian nationalists are faced with a choice between upholding the biblical principle, not just biblical principle, the univocal biblical witness that the Son of David will be king over all of the earth, and that those that put their faith in him are his family. Or, well, we have these theological justifications for wanting to impose certain laws of morality on society through the force of the secular government. And Romans 13 says the authorities are established by God. So we know that they must be there because God wants them to be there. But no, that's not what's happening. Like, God never, and I've read Genesis 1 and 2 too. I don't think God ever intended for the Babylonians or the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire to ever be that powerful. But I also don't think that God ever felt like, we're getting into some really abstract stuff here. Let me put it this way. It's very clear that Assyria and Babylon, whatever you make of the text themselves, had no eternal value. And they were still considered God's servant. They were still called his servants. They were established by God. Both of those empires were for a specific purpose. And then God utterly destroyed them when their purpose had run its course. And I think that we should take that in consideration when we're reading Romans 13. This isn't just saying, oh, well, you have to accept democracy. You have to accept the income tax. You have to accept the military industrial complex. You have to accept all. No, as Christians, we don't. And we don't have to think that these are inevitable parts of life. The progressive Christians also get this wrong too. And I had literally on Twitter one time, this is so funny. There's kind of a semi-famous progressive Christian influencer who I said something and he made this really kind of negative and snarky comment. This was back, in 2024, when I would try to have nice and respectful conversations with these progressive Christian influencers. And then I realized that they act just like Mark Driscoll, every single one of them, and they're huge jerks online, and you can't actually have a productive conversation. So I asked him very I don't know. It was in the run up to the election, and he was talking about Kamala Harris or whatever. And he wasn't even he's a Canadian. He's not even American. And I was just like, hey, have you considered that her administration is funding a genocide against Israel? And so maybe you can say bad things about Trump all day long. It's cool. But then you should also be critical of your own team, because it seems like they're just as complicit in war crimes as the Republicans are, which is an objective truth. And he's like, well, you're a Christian libertarian. Haha. Why would I take your position seriously? And I was like, well, I just think that we should consider whether or not our tax dollars should go to support the military, and why aren't you more critical, or not the military in general, but like maybe our tax dollars shouldn't go to supporting a genocide in Gaza. And he told me, this progressive Christian said, well, Romans 13 says to pay my taxes. Unbelievable. But it's that situation, though, what that proved is that for both the progressive Christians, who are completely enthralled with state power, they're obsessed, they worship the power of the state, and Christian nationalists who also worship the power of the state, because progressive Christians are just they're just Christian nationalists too. There's left-wing Christian nationalists. They both absolutely worship the power of the state, and they will both selectively read decontextualize Romans 13 in order to justify their preferred policy programs. Whereas when I read that, I think that, this is set obviously in the context of Jesus being king over all creation, God calling a united, universal Jew plus Gentile church that is transnational, that goes beyond boundaries, and then also saying that we have to be renewed and transformed in our relationship with God, which is not, so we have to be renewed by, or transformed and renewed so that we can understand the will of God. And then Paul says, you need to be at peace with all people. And then he says, just, the authorities are established by God, pay your taxes, do what you got to do, live at peace with all men, don't take vengeance upon yourself. And oh, by the way, we know that the hour is almost at hand when Jesus is going to return and bring all of this nonsense to an end. Right. So when I read that passage and I think of Paul's comments about the authorities being established by God, I think, well, that's not a compliment because it means that they don't have any enduring value. And as Christians, if we can participate in a supposedly democratic system where we have the right to voice our concerns about the overreaches of government power, is government by the people for the people. We all know that's a lie, but that's at least what they say. That's what they tell us in schools, right? Then I think that we should be able to say as Christians that we don't support this system and that we don't want to increase its power. And it's okay to have that position. And it's okay to say that Romans 13 isn't a universal affirmation or legitimation of secular authority or even civil government at all, because I don't think that's really what is going on in the text. I don't think that's what Paul's trying to do. Paul's function is clearly trying to help the Romans live in a manner which is consistent with their identity in Christ, the Jew-Gentile family of the Messiah, who, according to Paul, is now ruling as king over all creation. And we have this verse or this passage in 1 Corinthians 2, 6 through 8, where Paul twice says, the rulers of this age are passing away. So kind of just like Assyria, just like Babylon, just like Isaiah 10 and Jeremiah 25. All right, the rulers of those ages were being used by God for a specific purpose, but then they passed away. And Paul says the same thing. The rulers of this age are passing away. And he talks about how they're obviously unwise, because if they were wise, they would not have crucified Jesus. Right. So they're passing away. That's the whole point here. Right. And so I think that what we should take away from this, and this is very, we're getting to the conclusion. Right? This is very surface level, but just something that we need to be thinking about. What we need to take away from this is that Romans 13 is not an endorsement of secular government or of arbitrary human government at all. Far from it. And when Paul says that the authorities are established by God, there's more to that statement than meets the eye. And we need to really think about how that statement functions and how it would have functioned in the mind of Paul. And I'm going to come back to close this out with a point that I am going to make over and over again. And I have made over and over again. We as Christians have to choose between following Jesus and thinking that the state can solve all of our problems, thinking that human government, arbitrary, coercive, violent, non-consensual government can solve our problems. It just can't. And it's a shame that there are so many American Christians who have completely sold out to the notion that we as a church need to have some sort of control over the levers of power in Washington, that we need to be able to impose our values on the rest of society by force. I just don't think that is what the biblical witness says. I think that we belong to a different king in a different kingdom. And while the rulers of the age are passing away, they haven't yet done that. And so we have to learn to live at peace with them, because Paul says, if at all possible, live at peace with all men. And he doesn't have any carve outs for politicians. So we pay our taxes for that reason. All right, we have to do that kind of stuff just to maintain the peace, kind of like seek the welfare of the city in Jeremiah 29:7. But at the end of the day, these governments that are servants of God, these authorities that are servants of God, they will meet the exact same fate as Assyria and Babylon, and the church and the kingdom of God will endure forever. And so what is it that we should put our hope in? Should it be, progressive conservatism? Should it be whatever? I say progressive conservatism because I really do see the further I've gone down this road, the more obvious it is to me that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and progressivism and conservatism, they're fundamentally structurally exactly the same. Their main contention and debate with each other is just about how to manifest their particular policy proposals. It's not like they both fully accept progressive and conservative Christians both fully accept and legitimize the use of arbitrary force against peaceful people. I don't think we should be in the business of doing that. And I don't think that when Paul says in Romans 13 that the authorities are established by God, that this means that they are always and forever divinely legitimated. And that's it. This will not be the last time that we return to this theme. This was me thinking through this and wanting to get something out there so that you can start thinking about it too. But as with all of these interpretive issues, they are all so much more complicated than Christians have traditionally understood them to be. And we have to be historically sensitive. We have to be historically sensitive. We have to pay very close attention to the intended function of the text, understanding what Paul is trying to do instead of just immediately jumping to what does Paul mean. And we have to situate this within the ubiquitous New Testament testimony that Jesus is the Davidic king promised in 2 Samuel 7, who now rules over all creation, and we are his people. And these people cannot be defined by national boundary markers or political parties or any of that anymore. We are defined by our faith in the only true king, which is Jesus. All right. This was a lot of fun today. One of the things that I'm going to try to do this year is, as you know, with a lot of my author interviews, my episodes are kind of scripted. I send the authors questions beforehand and I don't deviate from the script too much, but I've been trying to have more unscripted conversations because I think that that's more fun. And I also got into such a rut over the last couple of years where I would interview people and not even really think during the interview at all, just kind of ask them the questions and let them talk. And I want this to be a little more interactive. And even like solo episodes like this, I used to spend like 2 or 3 hours prepping for a solo episode before I went and did anything to make sure it was really polished and clean. I sat down for maybe 10 minutes after I read my Bible this morning, sketched this all out on a piece of paper, and I was like, I'm just going to go and riff it. So hopefully you enjoy this. I like being a little more spontaneous. Sometimes my thoughts aren't always completely organized like they ought to be, but you get the point. And that's I think maybe that's one of the reasons why people like this show. It can be a little random at times, but I feel like we stayed on point today, stayed on message. So I guess all of that to say, I really appreciate you guys sticking around to the end of the show and listening to all of my ramblings about Romans 13 and what it means to for the authorities to be established by God. So as always, thank you guys for everything you do. Libertarianchristians.com/shop. You can buy Protestant Libertarian Podcast merch. Again, 2026. I'm hoping we can get more stuff out there for my show. I'd love to get some shirts or hoodies. We're gonna work on some of that stuff. I'm gonna be really pushing for more merchandise. You can always donate to the Libertarian Christian Institute. That helps. I get paid to do this. It's not much, but it's a little bit, and every little bit helps. So go and support the Libertarian Christian Institute. I love the work we do there. Really believe in it. That's great stuff. Follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Go over and subscribe on YouTube. We're going to be doing more video content. I'm planning in the next month or two to completely update my video system. So videos are going to be hopefully 1080, higher quality, and be able to have graphics and all kinds of nice stuff there. So we're really hoping to increase the production. Can't do that without money. So, please help us out if you can. That would be awesome. Or even just, go over and iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast, give this show a good review, and stay tuned for more information about my forthcoming book, Politics, Economics, and New Testament Interpretation, which will be out later in 2026. Okay. I think that's it. I love you guys. And have a great week. And I will see you all next Tuesday. Bye.